Do you believe in divine judgment? In New Orleans, a frightening and almost unbelievable story unfolds, revealing that sometimes nature's justice can be more ruthless than any court sentence. Imagine a criminal fleeing from the police after a robbery, finding refuge in an old abandoned church, a place that many years ago lost its spiritual function and turned into a symbol of abandonment and silence. To him, that place seemed to be the perfect hiding place, a shadowy refuge where no one could find him. But what he didn't know was that the silence of that place was a trap, a false tranquility that would hide something much more dangerous. Have you ever been in a situation where one mistake, no matter how small, ended up changing everything? That moment when a seemingly simple decision turns out to be fatal. Well, that's exactly what happened to him. Climbing onto the altar of the church, something that seemed like an attempt to hide better, he made a choice that would change his fate forever. A miscalculated move, a part of the ceiling that fell, and suddenly, the darkness he sought turned into a nightmare. By knocking down an old structure, he freed a swarm of marimbondos that until then remained hidden under the rusty roof. What happened next was something that left everyone who witnessed the scene speechless. The marimbondos, like a living shadow, descended from above with a frightening fury, attacking relentlessly. The aggressiveness of that swarm was so intense that the man, desperate, began to scream for help, his cries for help being confused with the sound of his own pain. Nearby residents, frightened by the screams, rushed to see what was happening, some believing that it was something supernatural, a divine punishment for their actions. And what the police found upon arrival was something that shocked everyone: a disfigured criminal fallen before the altar, unable to move or flee. Stay with me until the end, because what you are going to discover now may surprise you, awakening a reflection on the power of nature and the justice it can present. This story, which feels like a horror tale, reveals that sometimes punishment comes from where we least expect it, in a way that no one can predict. And what happened that night in New Orleans was not just a fatality, but a kind of trial that left deep marks in the memory of those who witnessed that episode. But this is only the introduction of a story that still reserves many details, secrets, and lessons that we can learn from it. Are you prepared to continue? So let's move on, because what comes next is even more impactful than you might think. If you were impressed by this story, know that it reminds us of how nature often reacts unpredictably and fairly, even without us realizing it. Perhaps this is a lesson in humility, showing that our actions can have consequences we don't imagine, and that the natural world has its own sense of balance. If this narrative touched you in any way, leave here in the comments what caught your attention the most, or if you have ever been in a similar situation where something unexpected changed everything from one hour to the next. Your opinion matters and helps create a richer and truer conversation here on the channel. Also, if you like this content, be sure to like the video. It makes all the difference so that more people have access to stories like this and can reflect on them. And of course, if you want to continue following this type of narrative, subscribe to the channel. Your participation is what makes this space grow and reach more hearts and minds open to stories that make us think and question. Here, every comment, every like, and every subscription contributes to a stronger community, where we can learn together from what the world has to offer us. So stick with me, because the best is yet to come, and there's so much more to surprise you on this journey of amazing stories and valuable lessons. It was night in New Orleans, and the sky laden with heavy clouds hid the moon, leaving the silence of the city even deeper and more unsettling. The deserted streets reflected the dim light from the lampposts, creating elongated shadows that danced on the sidewalks, giving the environment a sense of mystery and abandonment. In this setting, an old church, long discredited, stood silent, shrouded in dust, cobwebs, and memories of a past that seemed as distant as the stories the walls carried. Its broken stained glass windows and rotting wooden door seemed to hold secrets from more glorious times, but now everything there carried an atmosphere of decay and heavy silence. For many, that place had a dark aura, almost as if it were a portal to another world, where time seemed to have stopped and the present mixed with the ghosts of the past. However, for someone on the run from the law, that scenario became the ideal opportunity to hide from everything and everyone. The criminal, desperate for a refuge, had found in the abandoned church a kind of secret shelter. His mind, dominated by fear and adrenaline, saw the place as a perfect hiding place, away from the watchful eyes of the police and the crowd. He had no idea, however, that there, in that sepulchral silence, was also hidden something that could change everything once and for all. Something that had nothing to do with his escape, but which had the power to turn him into a victim of a force far greater than he could have imagined. That man entered with silent steps, trying not to make a sound, while his eyes searched every dark corner of the space. The feeling of isolation was so intense that it seemed to envelop the entire atmosphere, as if the place itself was breathing, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. His heart raced, and his breathing grew heavier and heavier as he walked among the broken wooden benches and shattered stained glass windows. To him it felt like a cave of shadows, a place where he could hide for a while until everything was resolved. But deep down, a sense of unease was beginning to grow, a kind of foreboding that he couldn't explain, although he tried to ignore it. As he advanced through the central aisle, his attention was attracted by an ancient structure on the altar. A kind of ceiling which seemed fragile and crumbling covered an area that, in his innocence, he interpreted as a kind of safer hiding place. Without imagining the consequences, he climbed the altar, seeking a position that would offer him greater security. It was then that, in an accelerated movement, when leaning on one of the parts of the ceiling, the old structure began to creak eerily. In an instant, a part of the ceiling fell, exposing a huge nest of marimbondos that, until then, remained hidden under the rusty boards and dusty stone ceiling. The swarm's reaction was instantaneous and brutal. Like a living shadow, the marimbondos descended toward the intruder with a blind fury, a force that seemed fueled by an ancestral revenge. The man, taken by surprise, was immediately attacked by dozens of creatures that stung mercilessly, while his hands tried to protect themselves from the wild attack. The smell of poison and the sound of stings echoed through the silent space, as he screamed desperately in a mixture of pain and dread. Their screams cut through the silence of the night, echoing through the walls of the empty church, until they reached the ears of whoever was nearby. Residents of the neighborhood, accustomed to hearing the sirens and noises of the city, were frightened when they heard that strange sound, almost like a scream of horror coming from nowhere. Some rushed out to see what was happening, believing that something supernatural was unfolding there, as if a divine punishment was manifesting before their eyes. When police finally arrived on the scene they found was breathtaking. The criminal lay fallen, disfigured, covered with stings, unable to resist or flee. His face, that expression of pain and surprise, remained frozen in the memory of those who witnessed the episode. It all seemed like a kind of invisible judgment, a greater force that showed its cruel and ruthless face, making it clear that that night, what he feared most had been brought to light in a way that no one could deny. After a thoughtless act, which bore the imprint of despair and recklessness, the man rushed through the streets of New Orleans as if time were against him. His steps were fast, almost uncontrolled, while his heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of adrenaline, fear, and hope of escaping the consequence of that mistake. In his mind, there was only one priority: to find a refuge, a place where he could hide from the police and the voices that now seemed to surround his every thought. For some reason, he believed that that forgotten church with its dust-covered walls and broken windows was the ideal place for this. Perhaps it was his hope that no one could find him there, or simply an illusion that time and space could protect him for an instant. But he had no idea that, at that moment, his fate was already sealed by a force far greater than his own decision to flee. When he noticed the side door of the building, partially open and with rotten wood, a momentary hope arose in his head. It was the opportunity he needed to disappear, to vanish from the sight of those who pursued him. With a quick movement he walked in, believing that his temporary confidence would be enough to escape the situation that had somehow spiraled out of control. To him, that space seemed like a perfect hiding place, a kind of isolated island where the police would not be able to reach so easily, especially on that dark night when the streets were empty and silence seemed to envelop everything around. In his head, every step taken inside the building reinforced the illusion that perhaps there he could hide until everything calmed down, until the dust settled and life returned to normal. However, what the criminal did not know was that momentary confidence was a dangerous illusion. That forgotten and abandoned building carried its own secrets, and his presence there had awakened something no one could have predicted. The heavy silence that seemed to give security also hid invisible dangers, which were waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Every detail of that place, the boards creaking under the weight, the cobwebs hanging in the corners, the smell of mold and decay, created an atmosphere of vulnerability which he would only realize too late. His mind, dominated by fear, tried to convince himself that everything there was a fortress, a barrier between him and the outside world, but the universe had other plans. As he advanced through the dark space, his eyes adjusted to the shadows, and he came to realize that the building was not as solid as it seemed. The walls, covered with peeling paint and dirt, seemed to sway at the slightest movement, as if they were about to collapse. His footsteps led him to a wooden door which creaked as it was pushed open, revealing a narrow, dark corridor. Every step Ali took seemed more like an attempt to move away than to advance, a desperate search for a point of safety. When he finally reached an empty room, he thought he was safe, until he heard a strange sound coming from above, something that felt like a whisper, a barely perceptible vibration, but enough to make his heart race even faster. Not quite understanding what was happening, he turned slowly, trying to see something in the gloom while fear turned into a cruel doubt. Would it really be safe there? Or had he entered a place where the very history of the building had an impact that he did not yet understand? And it was at that very moment that his confidence was shattered by the unexpected. As he leaned against the wall hoping to catch his breath, a part of the ceiling began to creak. In an instant, an ancient structure, laden with dust and webs, collapsed on him, exposing a nest of marimbondos that, until then, had remained hidden under the rusty boards. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. Like a living shadow, the marimbondos began to descend towards the invader with a wild fury, as if the entire building had been awakened by a force defending its space. And in that moment, everything changed. The fear, which previously seemed controllable, turned into a desperate struggle for survival, as the man tried to protect himself from the bites, screaming for help, while the swarm attacked mercilessly, as if wanting to punish him for his daring to invade a space that, in fact, carried a hidden truth that he could never imagine. Now it was all a matter of impact, of decision, of a journey that would take him to a limit he had never known before, and that perhaps would be the turning point in his own story of choices and consequences. That night seemed to have been marked by a sequence of decisions that, without realizing it, were preparing for an irreversible impact. The man, frightened and desperate, was desperately looking for a place where he could hide from the invisible threat that he felt around him. His mind, filled with panic, led him to climb the altar, believing that this would be a point of greater safety, a temporary refuge where he could pull himself together and plan an escape. But in fact, this decision was the turning point, the action that would trigger a whole chain of events that would change everything forever. He leaned against the ancient structure, his body tense, trying to balance himself while his eyes scanned the environment in search of some way out. And it was at that moment that the decisive impact happened. A part of the ceiling, which seemed as fragile as wet paper, gave way under its weight. The sound was muffled, almost like a dull crack that no one could hear far away, but which reverberated in the tension-laden atmosphere. In one swift movement, a portion of the rusted and rotting structure fell away, revealing something that had been hidden for years. What was there under the layer of dust, webs and dirt was a gigantic nest of marimbondos, a veritable fortress of insects that until then had remained silent, waiting for their moment to act. The revelation came as a cruel surprise, as a hidden truth that came to light abruptly and devastatingly. The shock of the discovery was immediate. The marimbondos, who until then had been in hiding, seemed to awaken with a hunger for revenge. Like a living shadow, the swarm began to descend at a frightening speed, as if it were a cloud of darkness moving with a force of its own. The man, taken by surprise, tried to retreat, but it was too late. The insects began to sting with a ferocity that seemed fueled by a desire for punishment. Their tiny but ruthless bodies hammered at his skin, seeking to injure and incapacitate the invader. The smell of poison spread through the space as he screamed, a mixture of pain and despair, trying to flee from the attack that seemed to have no end. Each sting felt like a small burst of pain, a mark it would carry for a lifetime, a cruel reminder of a decision that seemed innocent but had triggered a shock reaction. The intensity of the attack was such that the ground itself seemed to vibrate under the force of the swarm. Her screams echoed through the empty space, a sound that mixed dread, pain, and a silent plea for help. Residents living in nearby houses heard this strange noise, a kind of scream of horror that cut through the silence of the night. Some ran scared, believing they were facing something supernatural, a divine punishment that had been triggered by a simple invasion. When police arrived on the scene they found resembled a nightmare scene. The man lay there, fallen, completely disfigured, covered with stings and with his face marked by an expression of pain and surprise. His body trembled, unable to move or escape, while the marimbondos still flew around him as if they were waiting for him to take his last breath. No one could have imagined that that night, marked by a seemingly simple decision to seek safety, would end with such a brutal and ruthless punishment. The force of nature had manifested itself cruelly, as a justice that knows no mercy, a hidden truth that came to light at the most unexpected moment. That impact, so small in origin, became the catalyst for a profound transformation, a lesson that would long echo in the memory of those who witnessed it. The story of that man and that episode have become symbols of how often our actions have consequences that go beyond what we can imagine, revealing a reality that is often hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to reveal itself with impact. And it is in this connection between decision, impact, and consequences that we find the true essence of this whole journey, a lesson that is marked in the soul, like a revelation that only reveals itself when we are ready to see beyond the surface. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the story that unfolded there was not just an isolated tragedy, but an open door for reflections on our own nature, our choices, and the invisible impact of everything we do, often without realizing it. The moment of chaos was instantaneous and devastating. Like a black cloud spreading with a force of its own, the swarm of marimbondos descended with frightening speed, invading every space around the man. Their tiny but ruthless bodies seemed driven by a will to punish, an ancient vengeance that had no mercy. He tried to retreat, desperate, but the flood of insects had already found a loophole in his defense. Each sting was an explosion of pain, a mark that burned his skin and his soul. The burning sensation of needles stuck in raw flesh was mixed with the dread of not knowing if I would be able to escape it all. Her screams cut through the heavy silence of the night, an agonizing sound that seemed to echo through the empty corridors of the old church, as if the building itself was crying its pain. The intensity of the attack caused his entire body to become a weapon of pain. He struggled, trying to protect himself with his hands, but insects multiplied every second, like a force of nature that could not be stopped. Her tear-stained eyes sought a way out, a hope that it was all just a nightmare, an illusion of horror that would soon end. But the truth was cruel. Every sting was a sentence, every desperate move, a futile attempt to escape a punishment that seemed to be administered by an invisible force which had no mercy or pity. The smell of poison spread through the air, permeating the nostrils of those who were nearby. The sound of the buzzing insects mixed with the scream of agony created a symphony of chaos that seemed to have no end. The man's skin, scarred by dozens of stings, began to turn red, swollen, as if being consumed by an invisible fire. His muscles trembled with exhaustion as he desperately tried to swing his body, hoping it would be enough to disperse the swarm. But the strength of the marimbondos was greater than he could comprehend, a strength that seemed fueled by a need for punishment, for revenge, to make them pay for their daring to invade a space that, there, at that moment, was sacred in a way he could never understand. That struggle, which seemed like a battle between life and death, seemed to last an eternity. His lungs filled with heavy air, his ears became deaf from the incessant ringing, and his vision began to darken in the corners. When he tried to open his eyes, everything around him looked like a mixture of shadows and flashing lights, as if immersed in a dead-end nightmare. Her cries of pain grew fainter, almost a whisper of farewell as her body gave in to the weariness, the pain and the impact of the punishment that night, had been quicker than any human judgment. The force of nature there, in that instant, showed its most ruthless and cruel face, making it clear that justice often does not need words or laws to be done. It just happens, like a shadow that descends from the sky and drags everything it finds. No matter how hard he tried to resist, his resistance was fading, and the last effort turned into a silent struggle for survival. The scene, marked by a natural brutality, seemed a symbol that sometimes the impact of our actions reveals itself in a direct and ruthless way, with no room for excuses or redemptions. It was as if the universe was saying that true justice does not need human courts or punishments. It simply manifests itself in the life force, in the essence of nature, which reacts in a just and inevitable way. At that moment, everything seemed like a great lesson of transformation, a revelation that would be marked in the memory of those who witnessed that episode. And as the man struggled with the pain, a sense that it had all been some kind of invisible judgment, a lesson that our decisions, however minor they may seem, can trigger unimaginable impacts, began to take hold. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the story that unfolded there was not just an isolated tragedy, but an open door to broader reflections on the impact of our choices, the weight of decisions, and the hidden truth that we often carry within us, waiting for the moment to come to light. The screams of agony still echoed in the silent night, penetrating the walls of the old church and spreading through the nearby streets like a whisper of horror. That sound, charged with pain and despair, seemed to defy any logical explanation, arousing a mixture of fear, curiosity, and disbelief in those who heard it. Residents who were a few blocks away were drawn to that sequence of unusual noises, as if an invisible force was drawing attention to something that went far beyond a simple tragedy. Some rushed out of their homes, in a hurry to understand what might be happening, while others, paralyzed by fear, stood behind the windows watching with wide eyes what looked like a scene from a horror movie. The street, until then deserted and calm, began to fill with frightened silhouettes, people trying to understand a phenomenon that seemed supernatural, almost like a divine punishment that manifested itself in a brutal way before everyone. When they got close enough, what they saw was a scene that defied any rational logic. The old church, with its broken windows and ajar doors, looked more like a scene from a nightmare than a place of worship. Inside, a figure slumped to the ground, covered in stings, his face marked by a mixture of pain, surprise, and even a certain resignation. The residents, who slowly approached, began exchanging frightened glances and whispering to each other, trying to decipher what could have caused it. To some, it seemed like a manifestation of a spiritual judgment, a punishment that came from beyond, a form of karma that manifested itself there, in such a brutal and direct way that it even seemed like a divine intervention. Others, more skeptical, tried to understand whether it could be an attack by wild animals or a simple natural tragedy, but the tense atmosphere and heavy silence that engulfed the environment indicated that something deeper and more mysterious was at stake. The testimonies that began to emerge only added to the drama of the episode. One woman who lived on the street next door said she heard the screams of horror around midnight. She described the scene as almost supernatural, saying it felt like the church itself was crying or manifesting in a way she had never seen before. A young man who was passing by at the time said that when he heard the screams he was paralyzed, feeling a heavy presence around him, as if a spiritual force was manifesting with a fury that he could not explain. Other residents reported that the sound of screaming sounded like a spiritual judgment, as if a heavenly force was punishing someone, or even an entity, wishing to expose the true costs of human actions that we often prefer to ignore until the impact is inevitable. The community, still shaken, began to gather in the street, exchanging stories, theories, and emotions, while looking at the place where it all happened. Some believed that the episode had a connection to the city's past, a kind of karma accumulated over the years, while others saw a clear message that the universe has its own ways of doing justice. The atmosphere that was created at that moment was of an emotional charge that no one could deny. It was as if the space itself was vibrating with an energy of judgment, of revelation of a hidden truth that somehow needed to come to light. And meanwhile, the figure of man there, fallen and completely disfigured, became a kind of symbol of that impact, of a lesson that nature or the cosmos was delivering viscerally, without mercy. Without mercy. The story, of course, had not ended there, but rather began to reveal its behind the scenes and the true lessons it carried. When the police finally arrived on the scene they found was something that looked like something out of a horror movie, but it was the harsh reality of a night marked by an impact that no one could deny. The man lay there, fallen before the altar, completely disfigured by the stings of the marimbondos, his skin covered with red, swollen and bloody marks. His eyes were wide, fixing an invisible point in the void, as if he had lost all strength and hope of escaping from that nightmare. The scene had a mixture of tragedy and irony of fate, a kind of punishment that seemed to have been delivered ruthlessly, almost as an inevitable consequence of his own decisions. There was no longer any resistance, only an exhausted and scarred body, a symbol that at that moment the justice of nature had been definitively done. Security officers, accustomed to crime scenes, were momentarily surprised by the intensity of the scene. The emotional impact was great, because they knew that this was not a simple matter of ordinary violence, but a kind of brutal lesson delivered by the universe itself. While one of them approached cautiously, another began to set up a kind of perimeter around the body, trying to prevent any detail from being destroyed or lost in the confusion of that moment. The tension-laden atmosphere seemed to show that space itself had been witness to a punishment that came from the depths of natural impact, a kind of judgment that manifested itself without warning, without mercy, only with a force that could not be controlled or avoided. The police then began to act more precisely, isolating the scene, recording every detail, while the residents who were still there, frightened, watched everything with wide eyes. No one could understand exactly what had happened, but everyone knew that they had witnessed something that went far beyond a simple episode of violence. It was a message of sorts, a revelation that the impact of our actions sometimes manifests in ways we never imagined, and that justice, no matter how hard we try to get away from it, always ends up finding its way. The environment itself seemed to breathe an energy of reflection, as if the walls of the church, long discredited, were now witnessing an episode of transformation, where the unpredictability of life is revealed in a raw and true way. As the police officers approached to make their first arrangements, a question hung in the air. To what extent do human decisions really control the impact they generate? Or is there often a hidden force, a hidden truth that only reveals itself when we least expect it? The scene there seemed to answer for itself, showing that the universe has its own way of balancing things, a form of justice that does not need human explanations. And as the man's body lay there, disfigured and vulnerable, a profound reflection dawned on those who witnessed it all. Perhaps that night, they witnessed a transformation that goes beyond the physical, a lesson that our decisions carry an invisible weight, a connection to something much greater, which often only reveals itself at the right time, in the most impactful form possible. And at that moment, the bridge to the next chapter of this story comes naturally, making it clear that the impact of that episode is yet to be fully revealed. After all, every event, no matter how devastating or mysterious it may seem at first glance, keeps in itself an essence that can transform lives, change perspectives, and open our eyes to hidden truths that until then were hidden under the surface of our own reality. The news of that shocking episode spread quickly through the neighborhoods of New Orleans, like a wave of impact that could not be ignored. It was not just a horror story or an isolated tragedy. It became a symbol of something deeper, a kind of warning that reverberated in the collective consciousness of the community. Many residents have come to call the event the divine judgment that night, reinforcing the idea that no one really escapes the consequences of their actions, no matter how hard they try to hide or flee from them. This narrative has turned into a kind of urban myth, a constant reminder that the universe somehow inevitably reacts, often cruelly, but always fairly. And this sense of justice, loaded with a symbolic charge, gained strength in the mouths of those who witnessed the episode, who saw there a kind of exemplary punishment which came from a higher force, a manifestation that no one could deny. The social repercussions were immediate. People talked at the doors of houses, in the streets, in bars, and even in churches, reflecting on what had happened. For some, it was a clear demonstration that human actions, however small they may seem, carry a weight that can manifest itself in unpredictable ways, but that deep down they carry a hidden truth, that the universe has its own methods of balance. For others, the episode has become a kind of warning symbol for those who still think about flouting rules, defying boundaries, or acting without thinking about the consequences. The idea that nature, or what we call force majeure, responds ruthlessly to our actions became part of the most serious conversations as a lesson that needed to be learned directly, bluntly, mercilessly. And as much as some tried to rationalize the event, explaining it as a natural tragedy or a fatality, most saw in the scene a powerful message, a sign that the impact of our decisions goes far beyond what we can imagine when it comes to acting. This story, loaded with symbolism, reinforced the mindset that life is a journey of constant choices, where every decision, no matter how simple it may seem, builds an impact that can manifest in ways we could never have predicted. It also brought to light the idea that hidden truths are often hidden beneath the surface of routine, ready to reveal themselves at the most unexpected moment, and that our responsibility is to be on the lookout for these signs. The image of that man fallen before the altar, disfigured and vulnerable, became a kind of living metaphor for how the impact of our actions can hit us directly and relentlessly. The community witnessing this began to reflect more deeply on what it really means to act with conscience, on the weight of decisions and the importance of understanding that the universe operates not only with human laws, but also with a self-justice, often invisible, but always present. This story became a frame for a lesson that echoes in the soul of those who listen, that our actions, no matter how minor they may seem, leave invisible marks that can manifest themselves in surprising ways, reminding us that in the great tapestry of life, everything is interconnected by a hidden truth that only reveals itself at the right time. And so the city of New Orleans came to carry even more its aura of mystery, where each episode has its weight, each impact its history, and each decision its consequence. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this story, as frightening as it may seem, reveals a hidden truth that many of us prefer to ignore, that our actions, however minor they may seem, carry an impact that often only manifests itself unexpectedly and definitively. This night in New Orleans became a symbol of transformation, a kind of mirror that reflects how the universe has its own ways of responding, of balancing things, of showing that everything we do leaves marks, be they visible or invisible. And the most striking thing is that often these marks do not show themselves right away nor the following week, but arise in a way that no one can predict. Sometimes they appear in a brutal way, as a natural punishment, a punishment that comes from an impact that we cannot avoid. Others, they manifest subtly in the form of lessons that we only understand a long time later, when everything has passed, and what remains is a deeper reflection on our journey. The story of that man, for example, is a powerful metaphor for all of this. He tried to flee, to seek refuge in the hope of escaping the consequences, but ended up falling victim to a force that knows no bounds. This force, which we can call nature, karma, or the very impact of decisions, has shown that many times the evil we do or the risks we take can turn into our greatest punishment. And as we witness such a remarkable scene, we are invited to reflect on how our decisions shape our path, how each choice, no matter how simple it may seem, has the potential to trigger a chain of events that can change everything from one hour to the next. This is a lesson that our mindset needs to be aligned with a broader understanding of the impact we generate, an awareness that the universe has a way of balancing things, often quietly but extremely powerfully. Many people who witnessed the episode saw in it a kind of revelation, a way for the universe to show its most ruthless face, but also its truest. The impact of the swarm of marimbondos was a direct lesson that justice does not always come with a formal trial, but often in ways that seem to be decided by a greater force, a force that knows our essence and that reacts to the impact of our actions. This experience leads us to question the extent to which our decisions really reflect a deeper understanding of the consequences they can generate. And by thinking this way, we realize that life is a journey of constant choices, where each step leads us to an impact that often will only be understood long after, when it is too late to change the past. It is in this context that we find the importance of reflecting on how our actions shape our destiny, how they create an invisible narrative that often only reveals itself at the most unexpected moment. This story, as frightening as it is, serves as a reminder that the impact of our decisions is a serious thing, a force that we cannot underestimate. And at the same time, it teaches us that transformation can come in ways we can't even imagine, that impact can manifest with a force that makes us rethink our attitudes, our values, our priorities. After all, life is a learning journey, where revelations often come in the form of impact or a lesson that we only understand with time, when everything has passed, and what remains is the reminder that everything is interconnected by a truth that, however hidden, always finds its moment to come to light. So when we reflect on this episode, it's impossible not to think about our own story. Every action, every decision carries a consequence that can be a bridge to transformation or a trap that traps us in a pattern of behavior. Impact, in this sense, is not just a reaction, but an opportunity for growth, a chance to understand that the universe responds in a way that is often wiser than we can imagine. After all, everything we do somehow leaves an imprint, an impression that can manifest itself at the most unexpected moment behind the scenes of our own life. And this is a truth that, by revealing itself, invites us to a journey of greater awareness, of greater attention to our decisions, and above all of understanding that the impact we generate is deeply linked to our evolution. Now, when thinking about all this, it is certain that each of us has the power to transform our history from the moment we recognize the weight of our actions and the force that the universe has to return what was sown. And in this search for understanding, perhaps it is precisely this connection with the impact, with the hidden truth, that helps us to walk a more conscious path, more aligned with what we really are and can become. If you made it this far, it's because this story touched something inside you. I think it's important to remember that our actions, however small they may seem, have an impact that we often only realize when it's too late. This narrative invites us to reflect on what we are doing, on the choices we make, and how they can turn into lessons or consequences that we carry throughout our lives. If you believe that this content has brought some inspiration or awakened a new consciousness, you are invited to subscribe to the channel. Here, we always try to bring stories that make us think beyond, with a closer look at the impact that our attitudes can generate. Leave a comment below saying that "I'm with you until the end," or some phrase that shows that you followed everything to the end. This way we can create a truer connection and exchange ideas on these important topics. Oh, and if you liked what you heard, a natural like helps strengthen this exchange because it shows that the content makes sense to you and that it is worth continuing to produce stories like this. To continue this journey, there is a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click there and stick with me here. I'm sure you'll enjoy learning more about these issues that involve impact, choice, and transformation. Stay with me, and until the next content.